Whomever you love, we welcome you. Whomever you love, we welcome you.
Good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us here at First Unitarian Church of Toledo. We love seeing you virtually this Sunday. We just have a couple announcements. Going into the fall, we have a few opportunities for engagement with the congregation. We will be shifting our music a little bit in these virtual services. So if you're interested in participating in any kind of virtual choir, please stay tuned for details on this Thursday. I'm forgetting the date and I don't have it in front of me, but this Thursday at 7:30, it's in your FYI as well. The 3rd. Yes. So that we can get more information and kind of gather about opportunities for recording yourself or for coming in individual appointments and being recorded here at church. You don't have to read music for it. We'll have plenty of opportunities. We also have our picnic September 13th at 1 p.m. Bring your own food on the church grounds, and there's enough time to travel after you watch your in-gathering service on YouTube at 10 a.m. 2 weeks later, on September 27th, we'll have a Stewardship Sunday, and there will be another picnic, and we'll include a mini auction. We hope to see you there.
Our opening words are by Martin Luther King Jr. Mickey and I will read those together. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied to a single garment of destiny.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
There are some things in our social system to which all of us ought to be maladjusted.
Hatred and bitterness can never cure the disease of fear. Only love can do that.
We must evolve for all human conflict a method which rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation.
The foundation of such a method is love.
Before it is too late, we must narrow the gaping chasm between our proclamations of peace and our lowly deeds which precipitate and perpetuate war.
One day, we must come to see that peace is not merely a distant goal that we seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal.
We must pursue peaceful ends through peaceful means.
We shall hew out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope. Our chalice lighting today includes words by Maya Angelou. History, despite its retching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon the day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream.
And now please join me in reciting our covenant. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. This is our great covenant, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. And our song this morning is number 1000 from our Teal hymnal, titled Morning Has Come.
Morning has come, arise and greet the day. Dance with joy and sing a song of gladness. The light of hope here shines upon each face. May it bring faith to guide our journey home. A new day dawns, once more the gift is given. Wonder fills the
story time with Kristen.
So today's story is Babies in the River, part of Heeding the Call from our Tapestry of Faith. Once upon a time, there was a small village on the edge of a river. Life in the village was busy. There were people growing food and people teaching the children to make blankets and people making meals. One day, a villager took a break from harvesting food and noticed a baby floating down the river toward the village. She couldn't believe her eyes. She heard crying in the distance and looked downstream to see that 2 babies had already floated by the village. She looked around at the other villagers working nearby. "Does anyone see that baby?" she asked. One villager heard the woman, but continued working. "Yes," yelled a man who had been making soup. "Oh, this is terrible!" A woman who had been building a campfire shouted, "Look, there are even more upstream." Indeed, there were 3 more babies coming around the bend. "How long have these babies been floating by?" asked another villager. No one knew for sure, but some people thought that they might have seen something in the river earlier. They were busy at that time and did not have time to investigate. They quickly organized themselves to rescue the babies. Watchtowers were built on both sides of the shore, and swimmers were coordinated to maintain shifts of rescue teams that maintained 24-hour surveillance of the rivers. Zip lines with baskets attached were stretched across the river to get even more babies to safety quickly. The number of babies floating down the river only seemed to increase. The villagers built orphanages, and they taught even more children to make blankets. They increased the amount of food that grew to help the babies be housed, warm, and fed. Life in the village carried on. Then one day at a meeting of the village council, a villager asked, "But where are all these babies coming from?" "No one knows," said another villager, "but I say we organize a team to go upstream and find out who's throwing these babies in the river." Not everyone was in agreement, but we need people to help pull the babies out of the river, said a villager. "That's right," said another villager, "and who will be here to cook for them and look after them if a bunch of people go upstream?" The council chose to let the village decide. If you were a villager, what would your vote be? Do you send a team upstream? So this story shows how do we just help the problem that's happening, or do we try to go find the source and do something about that? The end.
Thank you.
For today's anthem, Bonnie and I will be performing Amazing Grace. I would love to remind y'all of the text of this. I think it's a familiar tune, but when we consider what grace means to you, ideas of redemption, ideas of fulfilling your best potential, there's a lot that I think can be reflected on this Sunday.
Thanks very much. Please join me for a time of meditation, contemplation, and prayer. On our minds this week are Jacob Blake as the latest victim of racism becoming news. There are Chadwick Boseman and cancer. The actor Chadwick Boseman did so much work in films while he kept his treatments out of the news. And knowing that the main figure of the movie Black Panther is King T'Challa, that actor is gone now, puts much more poignance in saying, "Hail Wakanda." Another cancer-related thing is a triumph of sorts in Over the Edge when our member John Pettigrew rappelled down the side of a building as part of a fundraiser for the Victory Center. We also think of weather, hurricanes, forest fires especially, and that people's lives get caught up in that. They still have their health challenges and extreme weather on top of that. And we still try to live our lives as best we can. My reading today for our time of meditation is The Flawed Understanding of Martin Luther King Jr. by Aisha Ansano. She wrote, "The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a radical. He was called the most dangerous man in America by the FBI and had a 17,000-page FBI file at the time of his death. It wasn't just KKK members or those in positions of power who disagreed with him or hated him. As Cornel West explains in his book, The Radical King, by the time of King's death, most of the country didn't like him. There was intense FBI pressure, including attempts to make him commit suicide," West reminds us. The Black civil rights leadership was trashing him. The white establishment had rejected him. The young Black revolutionaries were dismissing him. Over the course of his life, King was not a man who was loved by most. In fact, he was hated by a select few. He was an incredibly maligned man by the time he died, and yet we never talk about that. Instead, we praise and honor him and hold him up as the highest standard of the struggle for justice. We as a society measure all who struggle for justice against Dr. King, but not against who he actually was. We measure those who struggle for justice against who we have decided Dr. King was, a sanitized version of the actual man. As a society, we tell activists that their protests are too unruly, their demands too harsh, their voices too strident, their methods too stringent. We have decided as a society that there is one way to struggle for justice, and it's the way we like to imagine King struggled for justice, even though it's not the way he actually did. In the summer of 2016, protesters took to the streets around the country, condemning police brutality and proclaiming that Black Lives Matter. Sounds familiar now, doesn't it? As has happened over and over again with these sorts of protests, Many people criticized their methods and tactics. In a press conference, Atlanta Mayor Kasim Reed stated, "Dr. King would never take a freeway." Anyone remember the powerful thing King organized? The marches from Selma to Montgomery? The ones that entailed several hundred people walking down a highway and crossing a bridge, blocking cars from being able to drive on it? The flawed understanding of King is everywhere, and it has seeped into our society's understanding of what is acceptable or appropriate in the struggle for racial justice. Let's observe 1 minute of silence. Spirit of life, come unto me. Sing in my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots only close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Today's reading are words by Teresa Hardy, Getting Through This Day. I got out of bed this morning because of all those who had to get out of bed before me. Martin and Coretta, the day after his home was bombed. What did they tell the children? My father, every day of his young life in Lowndes County, Alabama. John Lewis, after nearly escaping death on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. My ancestors, who were dragged to the U.S. in chains, laid flat like chattel on ships, and survived. They survived and got out of bed each morning. I am sick and tired and grieving and ready to quit this country. But I got out of bed, shamed by the thought of letting these ancestors down. For now, that's how I'm getting through this day.
Recently, there was national unrest in response to the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Unfortunately, there are so many names of Black people killed without justification by police that for future viewers, I have to give the context that this is when a police officer had his knee on the throat of a Black man he was arresting, for so long that the man died as a result of not being able to breathe. In protest of the police behavior and seeing the racism of the situation, demonstrations erupted all over the U.S. in solidarity with the actions seemingly everywhere to the current practices of many in law enforcement in this nation, of institutions and of individuals. Members in our congregation held a weekly Black Lives Matter vigil here in Toledo along our church's front curb at evening rush hour, a visible but quiet demonstration against racism. The Toledo Unitarians recognize that racism is everywhere, that there is systemic, organizational, and personal racism. And we have awareness that many, if not all, of the white people in our circles, our own selves included, carry blemishes of being racist in our past and even today, and of benefiting from racism. We learn and we grow, and we give more attention to our inclusive Unitarian Universalist principles. I and most others here who are white do realize that it's not enough to have words and vigils if we don't also practice what we preach. We're at the final installment of this 5-part month-long series I called Catching Up. And today's topic is anti-racism and pro-social justice. Black Lives Matter. I'm not going to use the practice that was the original concept for this Catching Up series, going through past articles and news clippings that I saved but hadn't gotten to for Sunday sermons, and using those stories to give kind of mini sermons while I trim my to-read list. No, that would be too painful. Too much review of what hasn't yet been resolved. Killing after killing. And there's too much need to be present, to be here now. So much is happening every day, and it seems the situation hasn't changed. The news is still that law enforcement people are too often responding in oppressive ways that result in the injury or death of Black people who shouldn't have feared for their lives in those situations. 239 people were shot and killed by police in the U.S. since George Floyd died on May 25th. That's all races, all shootings, regardless of if those who were shot were armed or not, regardless of whether the shootings were justified or not. The United States is a gun culture. So it seems an average of about 2.4 people every 24 hours shot and killed by police is acceptable. Only the racially charged, seemingly unjustified deaths from police shootings make national news. The most recent shooting that has racism as an apparent factor is Jacob Blake being shot 7 times in the back 7 days ago in Kenosha, Wisconsin, leaning into a truck where his 3 children were seated, according to reports. Jacob Blake is in the hospital, alive but paralyzed. There are many others. Let's be sure we don't just say it, that we live it. Black Lives Matter. Here's one point I want to be sure to make. There are drawbacks to spreading this message of inclusion. Some people feel that continual attention to anti-racism in the larger Unitarian Universalist movement and in our congregation, as you hear this in sermons by commissioned lay ministers, by guest ministers, and by me, detracts from the fuller Unitarian Universalist experience and its message, even that the inherent worth and dignity of every person, the first of the 7 principles that our congregations covenant to affirm and promote, is somehow unbalanced by calling attention to police overreach and to the Black Lives Matter movement. To some, we might be too much social justice and too little spirituality. But that's up to interpretation. And I do try to give a good mix of the broad elements of Unitarian Universalism. And there are people even in this church who are in law enforcement. And I want to express appreciation for the Toledo Unitarians, police, and corrections involved members. I know you hear a lot of words coming from your congregation that don't sit well with you. And I hope you recognize that there's a larger picture we're looking at. And I also want you to know that we appreciate that you carry Unitarian Universalist values in your work. You have our love. Unitarian Universalists are anti-racist in our philosophies, theologies, our grounding documents, and in our interactions. It doesn't always look that way, in part because we're kind of catching up in living our beliefs to what our words have been in longer term. Also in part because we're now recognizing at so many levels our having been anchored in white supremacy. And in part because many of us are just becoming conscious that racism isn't out there in other places, but here with people and places we're close to. And we have individual burdens to work through, I know. Language and actions, thought, word, and deed aren't yet in total alignment. Let's stay together and help each other to be nearer that destination. Now to the pro-social justice part. The Black Lives Matter Vigil. I've been going the wrong way. The Black Lives Matter Vigil is one example of our social justice involvement. We do so much more in our congregation and as part of Unitarian Universalist Justice Ohio and the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, for example. Rather than recap Unitarian Universalist social justice, I want you to catch up by listening, and I hope the words will inspire you. There's one published piece I'm going to share. I'm going to read you the final essay that John Lewis wrote just before he died of cancer on July 17th, 44 days ago, and which he submitted to the New York Times. John Lewis was a ministerial student when he began his civil rights work in the 1960s. He's remembered largely for being injured on Bloody Sunday in Selma, but continuing his work and being the head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He later was ordained as a Baptist minister, but found his sacred calling to be politics and social justice rather than the traditional pulpit. You might say his congregation was Constituents and Congress. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in the 5th District of Georgia in 1986 and served almost 34 years until his death. Before that, he worked in social justice organizations and government. John Lewis wrote this piece in the hospital where he was admitted shortly after his last public appearance at what had just become Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, D.C. And here's a picture of him there. He embodied the best qualities of being an icon. So let's take his words into our hearts and minds. This is his essay. While my time here has now come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great American story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people, motivated simply by human compassion, laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race, class, age, language, and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. That is why I had to visit Black Lives Matter Plaza in Washington, though I was admitted to the hospital the following day. I just had to see and feel it for myself that after many years of silent witness, the truth is still marching on. Emmett Till was my George Floyd. He was my Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. He was 14 when he was killed, and I was only 15 years old at the time. I will never, ever forget the moment when it became so clear that he could have easily been me. In those days, fear constrained us like an imaginary prison, and troubling thoughts of potential brutality committed for no understandable reason were the bars. Though I was surrounded by two loving parents, plenty of brothers, sisters, and cousins, their love could not protect me from the unholy oppression waiting just outside that family circle. Unchecked, unrestrained violence and government-sanctioned terror had the power to turn a simple stroll to the store for some Skittles or an innocent morning jog down a lonesome country road into a nightmare. If we are to survive as one unified nation, we must discover what so readily takes root in our hearts that could rob Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina of her brightest and best, shoot unwitting concert goers in Las Vegas, and choke to death the hopes and dreams of a gifted violinist like Elijah McClain. Like so many young people today, I was searching for a way out, or some might say a way in. And then I heard the voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on an old radio. He was talking about the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence. He said we are all complicit when we tolerate injustice. He said it is not enough to say it will get better by and by. He said each of us has a moral obligation to speak up, to stand up and speak out. When you see something that is not right, you must say something. You must do something. Democracy is not a state. It is an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we called the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself. Ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. Voting and participating in the democratic process are key. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide. So be it.
Thank you very much. As we come to our offering in today's service, if you're so inclined, please visit us at uutoledo.org or send in your offering to our Glendale address. We have 3205 Glendale Avenue, or you're able to give online by clicking on Give and then clicking on Online Giving. If you are inclined and able, every donation is appreciated.
So let's tell you what's coming next week, Labor Day weekend. Our 10 a.m. Spiritual Adventures Forum will feature Nolan Rosenkrantz, a reporter for The Blade, who is president of the Toledo News Guild. And the Blade union workers are in something like the third year of attempting to negotiate a new collective bargaining agreement with the newspaper. And Nolan will talk about the history of unions, a labor topic for Labor Day. And then at 11 a.m., our member Soroya King. Soroya is also a bishop and apostle in a Pentecostal faith, but she very much is Unitarian Universalist and preaches a couple of times a year when we can have her here. She'll be speaking about on taking a spiritual vaccine.
Immediately after today's service, we invite you to our Zoom social hour. You can grab a cup of coffee, cup of tea, and we love to see you. Check in, and visitors are warmly invited.
Our closing words are by Martin Luther King Jr. This is where we are. Where do we go from here? First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth. We must stand up amidst a system that still oppresses and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. And this is what we must see as we move on.
Our words as we send the flame are adapted by William Sinkford. We are a gentle and generous people, but let us not forget our anger. May it fuel not only our commitment to compassion, but also our commitment to make fundamental changes. Our vision of the beloved community must stand against a vision that would allow the privilege of the few to be accepted as just and even holy. Our religious vision must again and again ask, who is my neighbor? And strive always to include more and more of us. As we intone the words that gave birth to this nation, we, the people, we are and we should be both a gentle and an angry people.